You all are obviously here because you're curious about all the different aspects of music that are out there. The last one of these that I did was on music, iterations, so you can actually imagine music in your head. That was a lot of fun to dive into. I don't know that we came up with any groundbreaking answers, but it was a lot of fun to explore the topic. So this is one that I wanted to explore because it's just one of those things that there's no real answers for. And I kind of figured out why, because there's a lot of mystery to it. Why is it that we are constantly, repeating ourselves in this influential way, kind of not liking the generation that was just before us, but going to the one that was before that? There's a lot of different reasons for that. But also there's nothing that's black and white here, because a generation is not just the first couple of years of that generation, right? It's the whole, however many years a generation lasts. And so this matter of influence is constantly happening. So it's very hard to get your brain around where something is happening at a given moment. But it's very hard to define. But we're going to base off of the Mark Twain quote about how history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, and that is usually what is going on with us. I love this picture to death. This is in these talks we kind of have a tendency to get a little clinical about genres and subgenres and all this stuff. And if you ever get into those conversations, you may feel like John Lee Hooker does in this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures ever. It was taken at a folk and jazz roundtable discussion in 1951 in Massachusetts, and it's a diagram of the evolution of blues music. And these are all great things that they're doing here, talking about spirituals and gospels going into blues, but then I love the look on his face. Yeah. It's like, why do we have to do this? Yeah. Just let me play my guitar. And this is one of those things that it is very easy to over-intellectualize this stuff, and so we want to move away from that as much as we can. But we might also feel the way Schoenberg did about being categorized. Of course, he was put in the wrong category. This is a very funny picture, because he was not a free jazz musician. He was a composer. The thing that kills me is this is the face he gave them for the cover of his record. Kind of like his music. It's okay.
That is him smart.
But I found something fascinating. My key into understanding how cycles happen and influence is not with a classical composer or a blues legend. It was with the Don Henley. Don Henley helped me understand this very, very easily. So, and one little example I'm going to show you about this. This is kind of fascinating to me. I've always been really fascinated by this particular example. In 1984, you guys know Don Henley wrote a song called Boys of Summer. Okay? And it has a clip in it that is pretty telling and pretty interesting. It's one of the famous quotes from the song.
Out on the road today, I saw a deadhead sticker on a Cadillac.
Remember this?
A little voice inside my head said, "Don't look back, you can never look back." Thought I knew.
So why does Don Henley say this? In 1984, why is he bemoaning the fact that he sees a deadhead sticker on a Cadillac? Right? What he's saying is he is bemoaning the fact that the Grateful Dead, who at the time of when they began, 1967, very much were the symbol of the free love hippie movement, right? And it was something that was decidedly non-commercial and kind of stood for grassroots authenticity. It's okay, it's musical in nature, it doesn't matter, it's fine. We'll talk later about what influenced that ringtone. But, so he's looking at this, and he's looking at it, by the way, 18 years prior, right? So 18 years before he wrote this, the Grateful Dead were very much this grassroots, free love, non-commercial thing. But 18 years later, he sees a sticker for them on a Cadillac, somebody who is affluent. So it very much tarnishes that he's basically lamenting the death of an innocence, which he did a lot in his music. Now, the cool thing about this is what happens later. About 19 years later, in 2003, there's a band called the Ataris. And yeah, they are very nostalgic, their name, the Ataris. Very nostalgic already. But 19 years later, they do a cover of the Boys of Summer, and this is the reference they use. So, Actually, a really good version of that song. They're very faithful to the music. But they're talking about Black Flag. And Black Flag was a band, one of the first real famous punk bands in 1984. They very much were anti-establishment. They were very much non-commercial. They stood for the same things. And so this singer is bemoaning the fact that he has now seen a Black Flag sticker on a Range Rover, Cadillac, or whatever, what have you, in 2003. So these two things are saying the same thing, these two versions of the song. And look, the distance between them is 19 years. Say 19 years ago, there was something true. He's saying 18 years ago, there was something true. So there's something interesting about just the influence of that one song and how it says something about the nature of influence already, which is to me, a nice little phenomenon. And then, of course, the examples are only 17 years apart. So we have this crazy kind of like roughly 20-year period that you'll notice where things become popular again, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. It's also interesting that 1984 is over here. 1984 is over here. I could keep doing number stuff and mixing them around. Get all conspiracy theory on it. What does Don Henley really know? But that's a fascinating example of what we're getting into. But the thing that one of my earliest introductions into this, actually before I do that, I want to show you this little thing I put together. We're going to come back to a couple of different timelines that I've done. The first thing to know is that these are mostly approximate. I'm not giving you exact dates of things because there are different reasons why we're looking at this. But we're looking right now at the 20th century and the development of different genres throughout the 20th century. And before we got to the 20th century, we already had developing blues music, gospel music, ragtime, Stephen Foster type stuff. Minstrelsy was very, very popular, and vaudeville. And those were very much part of the musical machine. And as we get into different eras, we start to develop new genres. What we're going to look at later is how technology, as different types of technology enter in, like radio, film, all those things, you start to see an explosion in genre development. And so what we're looking at here, of course, the war halted a lot of stuff. But once we get into radio, television, all these other things, you start to see a whole lot more blue lines, a whole lot of things that actually begin happening and developing. And so there's actually a ramping up of genre development over the years, and it has a lot to do with technology. A couple of them that we probably are familiar with. The very first kind of iteration of American folk music that we think about, happened in the late 20s into the 30s. Our own Josh White from Greenville was very much a part of that. When he went up to New York, he and Burl Ives were very much the face of folk music at the time, and some other people. Then, of course, there's the war, but then something happens around 1960. There's a resurgence, right? Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, all of these amazing folk singers start coming up. But they are referencing, a lot of people my age believe that this was the first time folk music had happened. But then we realized, it actually was popular in the 30s too. And then, and I put my own little abbreviations here. Hair is not a genre. I put that in there to remind myself of something. But then there's a whole coming back to roots in acoustic music in the 80s that you see with a lot of rock and roll folks. MTV Unplugged became popular. There were a lot of groups that were like Rusted Root and other groups who embraced a roots thing. And then once we get into the 2010s, you start to see the Millennials coming out with a lot of more folk music, like the Lumineers and other bands like that. So you almost see this daisy chain of folk music influence that pops up about every 20 or 30 or so years. Sometimes it involves politics, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just the sound that they're embracing. When the British invasion happened in the early part of the 60s, they were referencing the beginning of rock and roll. They were bringing something back to us. They were also bringing back a lot of early American blues music. So these influences aren't just within our own country. A lot of times they're within certain genres. And then all of this will happen. So we'll come back to this quite a bit. Another thing that I wanted to just get clear before we get going here is the difference between an influence and a fad. And that's one thing I'll reference a few times. Whenever we go along, there's usually a trendsetter, right? Elvis was a trendsetter. Ariana Grande is a trendsetter. Jay-Z is a trendsetter. Or, a lot of the Beatles were trendsetters. When a trendsetter does their thing, and they are at the top of that wave of popularity, they feed into fads, but they also feed into influence. Fads are a short-term thing. So when Elvis was popular, there were about 100 Elvises that came out, right? Whole bunch of guys doing their hair this certain way, started to sound like this one to sing, and it began, and the guitar sounded to sound like, their guitars. So that very much was a short-term thing. And of course, trendsetters create their own genre sometimes. It happens. But influence is more of a long-term thing, right? I listened to this when I was growing up, or my dad played this, or my grandfather played this, and I'm influenced by the larger work, not the sensationalism of the fad or what it looked like or the image. Then you also have, in the fad, it very much is about what is in the zeitgeist at the moment. Okay, and so those of you not familiar with the term, zeitgeist is a kind of from a German term meaning the spirit of the age, spirit of the time. So usually it's the popularity wave. I like to think of it as a wave that's just constantly rolling through time. Somebody's at the top of it, always. Depending on their level of influence, they ride that wave longer than others. The Beatles went longer than a lot of people, right? Some people are a one-hit wonder. They're at the top of the wave for a second, and then they instantly sink. And so that idea of a wave is really helpful for me to think about in those terms. Also, with these trendsetters, you'll get a lot of copycats. That really is a product of the music industry. They're just seeking to repeat what's popular. But then you have sometimes generational versions of these people. You'll say this person is this generation's Hank Williams, or this person is this generation's Aretha Franklin. And that's because it speaks to a greater level of influence, a stronger level of influence. This copycat thing, of course, you've heard it all the time. Our own, I'm going to keep mentioning Greenville people. So Escarita was from Greenville. He was a pioneering rock and roll figure and one of Little Richard's friends, and they kind of copied one another's styles over the year, and Escarita actually taught Little Richard how to play boogie-woogie style piano on the left hand. He was a brilliant pianist. But he wasn't quite, let's say, radio friendly. He was a very rough and gruff kind of guy, also had a lot of problems. But Little Richard was it. He was the most popular thing going at the time. And so Capitol Records was very interested in milking as much out of Little Richard as possible. But a problem happened when he went and found the Lord and became a minister, right? Capitol Records did not know what to do. They were like, oh my goodness, this is our number one seller, and all of a sudden he's rejecting rock and roll. So they start looking for replacements. And so Escarita was somebody that they considered a possible replacement. They brought him in, they recorded a record, they gave him all of Little Richard's old clothes, none of which fit him because he was an enormous man and everything came up to here. So he had to let out the stuff. And they tried it. Didn't work because Escarita was not Little Richard. He was a guy who you'd like to go see at a bar, not a guy you're going to see at Madison Square Garden. So it's an interesting thing that happens with that. There's always, people in the music industry are always looking at, here's our number one thing, then what do we have that is comparable to that we can cycle and work with? When the Beatles came out, all of a sudden you have 100 bands that sound like the Beatles, right? A lot of them from England, and they have the blank, the Hollies, the Dave Clark Five, whatever it is. A lot of them sound like the Beatles. So, but every now and again, they'll have really good songs, and they'll become a little bit more influential. So none of these things are exactly cut and dry. Another thing I've noticed is that when a trendsetter does their thing, if it's a fad, a lot of times it boils down to singing styles or the style of playing an instrument. I'll get to that in a second. And then when they influence in a longer term, it has more to do with their instrumentation. Unusual. But when something is a fad, I don't know if you guys have seen this. Have you ever heard of people who have a distinct voice and then all of a sudden, for the next 3 or 4 years, you start hearing people that sing like that? Does this happen? Yeah? Happened with Elvis quite a bit. I think of in the 90s when I was high school and stuff, I remember when Pearl Jam became really popular, right? Eddie Vedder had a very particular way of sounding when he sang. It sounded kind of like Cher. He had like an R coloring in his voice all the time. It sounded like this when I sang, right? And that's the way he sounded, right? And all of a sudden, Creed and these other groups that are right around the same time, you start hearing guys singing like this when I sang, and we call it the Billy Goat voice, and it literally became popular among alternative rock musicians. You see the same thing a lot also with recording artists, that do that. So there's a lot of styles, also with guitar playing, for instance, when, Eddie Van Halen in the 80s made it very popular to tap on the guitar and do that super fast stuff. Then you see crops of other bands doing the same thing. So influence works in two ways, the short term and the long term. That's basically what I want us to think about here. This is the last thing the last timeline I'm going to show you, but this is one I'm actually really proud of. I like this timeline a lot. This goes back from, and we'll come back to this a lot. This starts with the 1400s all the way to the year 2000. And what we're looking at here is accessibility, how music was actually accessible to people back in those days. It's something that our kids, for instance, take for granted because they can whip out their phone and get anything they want at any time. But if you look at the Renaissance, for instance, right in the middle of the 15th century, that's when printed music first starts appearing. But who can access it, right? Hardly anybody. Once you get into, the 1600s, into the Baroque era, the printing really spreads across Europe, but it's still only available to amateurs, or wealthy amateurs. And what we're still relying on a lot is the oral tradition, where a lot of folk music and all that comes from. Then, as we get to 1700, that's a real moment, right? Because things start to happen a little differently. Middle-class households start buying sheet music for home performance, but not many of them are musically literate. Still, a majority of the population of society, especially in Europe, was musically illiterate. So we only have a few that can do it. The pianoforte comes in, which is what we're all about here. And so music now in the home becomes something a little bit more attainable, especially if it's something that's written by a composer that you admire. And then regional performances also, with globalization and travel and those types of things, start to beef up a little bit. The real thing for me, especially in our area of the country, is when the railroad comes in. Because if you look at influence and how you are able to hear music from around the world in other places, before the railroad, especially let's say we're in Greenville, South Carolina, you're only going to get it at church. If you see a mill band that has like a brass band that's playing music, or if you have a neighbor with a guitar, or a traveling musician, or people who are playing the blues, or what they would call hillbilly music back in those days. So before the railroads, you really only had what was around you. Of course, you had sheet music as well, but you didn't have recordings yet, okay? You had to rely on what was able to be heard live. So I put the railroad here, which is a little late, but I'm thinking about Greenville specifically because after Reconstruction, right around 1880 is when we start really seeing the benefits of being on the railroad. What happens in Greenville at that time in 1880 is astonishing. So imagine that you're here in Greenville, you're, doing your thing, making your living, raising a family. The railroad comes in, and all of a sudden in Greenville, you have an opera house, and you've got 3 or 4 vaudeville houses in Greenville, all downtown. Each one of those has their own band, they have their own stuff, but shows start touring and coming to town. They've been doing this to bigger towns before, but right around 1880, Greenville starts getting its first touring acts, its first touring musicians. And imagine how much of a game changer that must have been for people in this town. All of a sudden you can go down the street and see what's playing in New York. You can go, something that you just read about and only dreamed about, before that, you can now go and see them. When vaudeville companies and operas and musicals would come to Greenville, to the Grand Opera House and a few other places, they would brag in their advertising about how many cars on the train it took. They'd say, this is an 8-car show. We're bringing an 8-car show to Greenville. And those kind of things were amazing. You didn't have anybody locally here that could do that kind of thing. So the railroads really were a lightning bolt for accessibility. Now all of a sudden you could go and see things and be influenced. And so that's why also in that other little thing I showed you, the genre development starts really picking up, right? If you're out in the field with nothing, you can't really be inspired to do much. But if you've got more people around you, you can hear more, you can see more, then more stuff starts to happen. Then the printing also becomes cheaper. And right around the same time, in the middle of the Romantic era, we see a boom in musical literacy. So now more people can read music. And that's thanks to all these other developments. Then we get into records, phonographs, Victrolas, not misspelled, that's just what they say, and those types of things. And so we get more ability to get, tangible music in a form that we can play at home. And then the radio is the next big one. That's the next big one. So the railroads come in, we can see things live. The radio comes in, now we can hear things from anywhere. And they don't have to be playing in our town, right? It doesn't have to be in our living room or anywhere else. We can tune in and get something totally different. That's really what helped jazz develop as a genre very quickly, and it became a very popular thing in those days. So radio is the next big one. Then we get into more ways of accessing music. Of course, film and television start to boost it even more with jingles and live performances on Ed Sullivan Show and things like that. Also, vinyl records, tapes, and CDs, we really start to ramp up until we hit this amazing threshold, which I think happens right around the turn of the century, and that is digital distribution of music, online distribution of music. And now we're at a point, folks, where it's very hard to tell where we are. Because everybody, my daughter, for instance, can whip out her phone, and by the time she was 16, had already been exposed to more diversity in music than I had into my 20s, mid-20s, playing in bands and stuff. So it's incredible what they can have access to. And that's a good thing. There are some things about it that are really horrible. We all know this. And one of the reasons that we kind of don't like where we are in terms of technology is what it's done to us socially. But what it's done in terms of music accessibility has been unbelievable. We can no longer look at music accessibility under this paradigm at all. It just doesn't exist anymore because now everything is happening all the time. Everything all the time. And that's why I consider this a real threshold. And it seems like we were ramping up until we hit it. You know, I am fascinated by looking at things in kind of a macro overhead view. And when you do that, you begin to understand the acceleration. It's almost like we were on a slope. From, you know, the beginning of the printed music all the way till the internet, we were just ramping up. Every now and again a war would stop things or whatever, but we were ramping up to this amazing moment of critical mass. So I like to think of it as influence often happens at the pace of technology. And we've seen this, you know, quite a bit, we just explained. But how do those things work in cycles? How does that work? I happen to think that it's primarily a 20th century phenomenon. You didn't see it that much before the 20th century because you didn't have as much access to music. You're not seeing it as much now because everything's happening all the time, and we're not just looking at what's in front of us. We're looking at whatever our choice is, and that's a very big difference. So one of my first exposures to this idea of cycles in music was this guy. Do we remember Bowser? Yes. Bowser actually is I just want there to be a picture somewhere in the video is still of a Sigal Music Museum Distinguished Lecture Series and Bowser being the graphic we're talking about. It's actually the very first concert I ever saw. I was in diapers and Shana and I was playing at the Memorial Auditorium with other groups. You can tell me who they were. But Shana and I is important. And that's the first instance I understood. It was like, wait, this is the 1970s. Why are these guys dressed like greasers? What is it about the 1950s that's so fascinating? And among musicians, especially rock and roll musicians, there was a real rejection of the burnout of the 1960s. Some of you may remember this. I don't remember it, but I've seen countless accounts of musicians talking about it. And after hippie culture kind of crashed and burned and Vietnam War happened and the economy was tanking, a lot of people were not so thrilled with what happened in the 60s in terms of the promise of that idealism kind of going away. So what they did, subconsciously or not, was look back at a period before that, the 1950s, where we had this post-war optimism, also the birth of rock and roll. There were a lot of things about it that were very tempting for them to look at. So here we are, looking back at this optimistic period of time. So they start idolizing the pioneers of early rock and roll and start trying to emulate them. The 60s, for the most part, most people in the music industry of popular music were not looking back at the 60s. They were a little, let's move forward, but something about it. They wanted the comfort of what happened in the past. This happened across the board, across cultures. You've got Happy Days, American Graffiti, Grease, Sha Na, of course. And so all through the 70s, you got a huge amount of 50s nostalgia. You guys remember this?
Kind of nostalgia for the innocence.
Yeah, nostalgia for the innocence. But it was also post-war. We weren't so innocent then. We had just seen the atrocities of Hitler. So, the world wasn't innocent. But we had this fresh start, and that felt really good. And so I think for people who had suffered the burnout of the 60s in a way, artistically speaking, we're looking back for inspiration, perhaps. And this is how this influenced us. So across the board, the entire country was looking back at the 50s, which is similar to something we're doing right now, actually. If I lose track of my notes, I'm not going to stay on track here. And the funny thing is, They were influenced by a lot of these folks like Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps, who were very much an early kind of hard edge rock and roll group. A lot of people in the 1970s, I'm just going to use punk music as an example because I think that's something we don't talk about enough at Sigal Music Museum is punk music.
And we never will.
Yeah, well, until now we are. But for instance, though, these guys, seriously, what do you think about punk music, whatever? I mean, there's some of it that is just, monkeys with guitars and that's it. There's no talent. But some punk music is really phenomenal. And so what they were trying to do was look for a raw connection to rock and roll, a raw expression that didn't have all this production around it. So Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps were very, very popular. Have to point out, their guitarist was Paul Peek, who's from Greenville. Another interesting connection. But they were also looking at people like Carl Perkins and Chuck Berry, who were the bad boys of rock and roll, and who had that kind of harder edge mentality about it. So one of the first bands that did this was a band called X, and X was one of the best early punk bands to exist out of Los Angeles. And they have this song called Johnny Hit and Run Pauline. And it's a remarkable song, but what I want you to do is, consider this is 1978, 79. Listen to how the song starts. Yeah. This guy was obsessed with Chuck Berry. So, but it's a punk song. But they idolized these guys from those rock and roll days. And of course, the Ramones, who took it even a step further with Rock and Roll High School, sound a little bit like the Beach Boys in this one. Not the best. Interesting thing is that X was discovered by Ray Manzarek, who was the keyboardist for the Doors, and he was an interesting fellow on his own. But he heard this band at the Whiskey Go-Go playing a version of Soul Kitchen, which is one of the Doors songs, but it was a very high-paced punk version of Soul Kitchen. But it was well done. So it was like, who are these guys? And he ended up realizing that the lead singers were both majored in poetry in college, and they were really, really good. And so he took them under his wing. And so Ray Manzarek produced the first 3 records that X made. So it's interesting to see how somebody from another generation will take a younger, group under their wing, and this happens all the time. So that's another element that feeds into influence, why things kind of sound like the old stuff, because sometimes it's somebody from that era who is discovering new talent and helping them along and probably influencing them a great deal because of it. So this reminds me so much of a fascination that we have had, annoyingly so in my opinion, in this country with a real 80s nostalgia. You've seen, this is a very kind of wide brushstroke idea, but if you think about digital, the 1980s were the peak of analog culture, right? It was the last bit of true analog culture. Yeah, there were maybe a digital watch here and there, but come on. All right, so we were there at kind of the zenith of what we could do with analog, and there was something that we really now look back on. Back in those days, we weren't like, yes, we're bathing in analog goodness. That didn't happen. We were looking for something better too. But looking back on it now, it was a time that was really, really hit home for a lot of people. Also, synthesizers were up, guitars were down. In a lot of cases in the 80s, you start to see the New Romantics, in the 80s, and all these groups that have synthesizers, and it's now a big thing. And sure, there was guitar in the 80s, no doubt, but it started to become less popular. Then in the 90s, we began to see the onset of the digital age. We started to see CDs, MP3s, digital music, early internet, and I mean bulletin board system early, but still, there were people that were doing things with music. And then guitars started to become more popular in the 90s, and people started to not like synthesizers as much. It's kind of funny how those things trade places over the decades. Then in the 2000s, we start noticing something very interesting. Right around 2005, 6, 7, right around the time the Ataris did their version of Don Henley's song. You see a lot of groups like the Killers and others start to sound like Duran Duran and like bands from the 80s. And I noticed this right around 2010 to where we are now. There's a lot of stuff that sounds like the music I grew up listening to. And I thought that was interesting. Then Stranger Things. All these other shows come up that are just all about 80s nostalgia. And the current 80s nostalgia wave has lasted longer than the 80s lasted. You know, seriously, think about it. There's been more stuff going on that is all like, ooh. Now, I grew up in the 80s. Yeah, it was great, but I mean, it wasn't, you know, the end all be all. But I think we all have a tendency to romanticize the era in which we grew up. We all do this, right? The same thing happens in music. So that's why you see this kind of leap over the 90s back to the 80s again, much in the way that the 1970s people were looking at the 50s. Now, this is not across the board, okay? This is mainly with rock and roll and blues and those types of genres. One thing that I've noticed also in looking at this is how white music and black music were still on different planes. And if you look at the development of black music from the early days, early blues into jazz, into R&B, into soul and funk, disco, into hip hop, it seems to be more of a linear progression. There doesn't seem to be as much referring back, which I thought was really fascinating. It's like, why does this seem to be, it's not completely a white phenomenon, but it's a popular music phenomenon, a zeitgeist phenomenon that we go back and look and look and look. There's lots of reasons for that. But part of what I think about this, now I could be wrong, chime in if you like, that once, you know, the civil rights movement happened and once, you know, we had more black culture coming into the top 40s and kind of mixing in, there's a newness for that. And I think that there was much more of an idea to explore the genres and have them feed in to, you know, top 40 music that didn't have so much looking back. I think a lot of white culture had the luxury of looking back, right? Because they had been at the top of that wave for so long. So of course we're doing this thing where we're looking back and looking back. But black music's a little different. Now, not that it's completely, you know, separate in that way, because there's lots of, you know, commingling here. But it's one of those things that popped out to me during this research that I thought was kind of interesting to look at. Then as we go into the 80s, you know, we get what I call hair bands, you know, which is a thing that just was it was just a stain on our culture. But, you know, we have a lot of people, do you guys remember when disco died? Remember? There was almost a moment, there was almost a day when disco was announced dead.
It's still alive.
No, yeah. But no, I mean, there was a moment, right? There was what was that baseball game where the DJ had to sing where they burned all the. No, there was a lot of homophobia around that, and there's a lot of racism around that too. So there's a couple of reasons why disco died so quickly, but it was on its way out anyway. And disco and soft rock and that type of stuff took a real nosedive. In the 80s, people did not want to look at disco. They wanted to, you know, in a lot of cases, we're looking back at some of the stuff that happened before. You know, you see a lot of these bands, some of these hair bands, which I'm not going to play examples of because I'm not going to play examples of them, you know, also have Chuck Berry riffs in their songs, which is kind of interesting. I'll never forget Poison. Poison was a really horrible band. We saw them open up for somebody a long time ago, David Lee Roth, I think. And they had a song that sounded like Johnny B. Good. It was very popular. Talk Dirty to Me was the name of the song. Yeah, so it sounded like a Chuck Berry tune. So a lot of these things were happening. And so also in the 80s, you start to see a lot of synths and a lot of reverb happening, a lot of big, open, echoey sounds, which is a fascinating thing to look at here too. Then we get, and of course, you know, we get into getting towards hip hop, soul music, funk and disco. Once we get into hip hop, something really interesting happens because it's the first time that black music is looking back, and very specifically, because the foundation of hip hop music is break beats, you know, using the breaks in different music to establish a piece of loopable music for somebody to rap over. So it's a James Brown song, for instance, and there's always a dance break in there, right? Where it's just the groove for like 3 or 4 minutes. They take that groove, they repeat it, and somebody raps into it. So of course, hip hop is a referential, I mean, what it does as an art form is look back. You know, in the early days, that's what was happening. And now hip hop is very much looking forward in a different way. But for the foundations of that genre for about 20 plus years, it was doing nothing but looking back. So that's kind of when black music hit that area, which is, you know, pretty cool. We could do a whole lecture on that. And then there's a white guy Motown boom that happens in the 80s with Billy Joel doing Uptown Girl, Phil Collins, You Can't Hurry Love, Queen doing Crazy Little Thing Called Love. They go back to the 60s as well, the early 60s for some of this. So you have a lot of that also nostalgia happening again across the board. And it's not that one period of time just looks to one decade. Of course, this is ongoing. So I'm just piecing them in places that are easier to look at. Then we get to the 1990s and something very funny happens. I'm just looking at alternative music as a return back to punk music and a rejection of reverb, a rejection of hair, a rejection of all this idea, and then Nirvana really puts the nail in the coffin of hair bands. It was a very interesting time when that happened. Nirvana came out with a song called Smells Like Teen Spirit, and all of a sudden, all these guys are out of work, and it's almost overnight. And it's incredible. There's even a video I saw of one of these groups, Warrant or one of those groups, who was playing for a couple hundred people, and they were saying in the interview that 6 months before that, when they came by, they sold that place out, and it was like 10, 12,000 seats. They come back 6 months later, and they're playing for 500-600 people. I mean, it was that fast because Nirvana spread like wildfire, and also it was the beginning of CD distribution, and so that also helped a little bit. I remember we only had our copies on CD, I think. I love this picture though because of the way these guys are looking at each other. It's kind of funny. This guy's not happy at all. He's not happy at all. But it's one of those moments in time, and every now and again there's a moment in time, like the death of disco, or the death of hair bands, or whatever. You can almost put them on a very specific place on the map.
Yeah, the 90s too was a bit of a rejection of corporate arena rock.
Exactly, yeah, and a return to things that were more natural again, more organic again. Absolutely right. I've got a funny map on here. I'll show you in just a second. So as we're looking at this is the same 20th century map I showed you before, but we've added some of these methods of listening. So you'll notice there's a lot more blue lines on this side over here. As radio begins to really develop, and television, tape, CDs, and all those things, we see a real ramping up before we hit that wall of online distribution. So one thing that everybody did is they did what I like to call climbed Mount Reverb. I made a little Mount Reverb for you guys. I know Chris will.
I was doing that this weekend.
Yeah. So reverb, for those of you who don't know, is an effect where you can make something sound like it's in a bigger room. Reverb chambers back in the 1950s, how they would achieve reverb and delay would be to record things at the end of a long corridor. And sometimes they would create corridors that would zigzag, so they would create an echo. So that slapback that you hear with Elvis singing, when you get a little bitty slapback delay, a little fast one, that's because they had an echo chamber built. And they put a microphone on one side and Elvis on the other, and then it gave them that sound. Mark V recording studios, which was one of the first recording studio in this area, did the same thing. There's if you haven't been to PKL Park, by the way, you need to go to the pickleball place because that was the original home of that studio. And Bill Huffman, who was the only surviving member of that group, told me that they tried to go and build an echo chamber in the basement, and they did, but they had to paint it with this toxic stuff. I don't know enough about that. With some kind of sealant they had to paint it with, and they had to keep getting pulled out because they would have passed out and died in there. He had no idea how they stayed living in that place. It was almost like being an oil man down the hole. So it was very interesting how those technologies were pretty primitive. But by the time we get to the 1980s, they find ways to do reverb in a different way. So the sounds get bigger. You guys know as well as I do, in the 80s, songs they sounded bigger, right? They just sounded bigger and bigger, and they got a little softer in their attack. So nothing was really hard edge like the Ramones anymore. It was very Don Henley. Very, the Beatles kind of ushered us into that.
Yeah,
so
that Phil Collins gated reverb too.
That's right. And I like to think of this reverb mountain as being a thing that really begins kind of with Phil Spector and those people in the Motown days making that nice big sound, and then it really ramps up in the soft rock. It's going crazy, and then by the time we get to the 80s, it is out of control. Like everything you hear has this big sound, and then it goes back down again. A little bit in the 90s, but once hip hop really takes hold of top 40, that mostly goes away. And nowadays there is this kind of almost rejection of it. There's music feels a lot tighter. When you talk about reverb, musicians and recording engineers will refer to it as wet or dry. You have a wet, dry mix. So if something is dry, it has no reverb. It's just the sound. If something is wet, it has lots of reverb to it, so it sounds like it's in a canyon. And so you're always looking at that wet, dry mix. And so you'll notice, that there's a lot of variety within one recording on different types of reverb. But this was, I just had to do that because I had to make a Mount Reverb for people. So this is something that I came across because I think it's, at least it applies to me. And I know it applies to a lot of other people too. But to look at the intervals in one's growing up and how that influences what they do. So from the age of 2 to 5, a lot of kids are just nursery rhymes. They're hearing the very, beginnings of things. They're repeating it back to you. I can repeat Mary Had a Little Lamb back to you. Great. Age 6 to 9 or so forth, kids might start playing instruments. Kids who are into the classical tradition really start that young. A lot of them don't, but they may begin to study. Some may be a little later. I didn't start playing music till I was 16 or 17, so this does not really apply to me in that part. Then something interesting happens. From the age of 10 to 13, there seems to be this discernment going on. This is the type of music I like. This is the type of music I don't like. And that kind of happens also right around the age of puberty, because you are beginning, as you all know, when you're a kid, your circle of concentration is this. It's me. And then it widens out a little bit to me and my family and my friends. Once you hit puberty, your circle of concentration becomes, I'm in society. And it begins to kind of become this thing where you realize that there's more out there than just what's in your house. And so they start to realize that this is the type of stuff that I like in the world. Once you get past puberty into that real kind of energy of exploring the world, you have a lot of people who are writing music at that age who are exploring and creating. I did a lot and a lot of friends of mine wrote a lot of things at this age that did not survive because they were, drafts of things to come. Young writers will write a lot at this age and not keep a lot of their material. This is the testing ground, right? But then when we get to this age, right around the early 20s, there starts to be this moment of early creation, actual mature creation that is informed by what came before, but is also, their brains are now fully formed, and they're able to, because it takes until you're about 23 for your brain to be fully formed. And then for me, it took a lot longer. It was like 48. But you start to see a lot of people doing their best work at this time. The Beatles also, from this age into this refined creation, 24 to 32, a lot of refined work. After that, they're very much in their maturity and they're doing what they do. There's not a lot of exploration anymore. Again, this is very kind of like, approximate. But what I think happens in that time is you have these two key periods that from the age of 24 to 32, a lot of what you're doing is influenced by the music that you grew up listening to. Plain and simple, right? I grew up listening to the Beatles. Therefore, once I learned how to play guitar and all that stuff, I want to learn a couple of Beatles songs. Then all of a sudden I start writing music that kind of sounds like them. Then I have to think, okay, what do I sound like? And a lot of musicians have that conversation with themselves over the years. So this also addresses that gap, that 15 to 20 year gap or so that we're talking about. So this is another thing that feeds into how influence moves in cycles. Because we are constantly referring back to the thing that was the first exposure to us, and that's just part of how that works. Another thing came to mind. People have always thought about. I know this is a weird looking thing. This is the way I think. I think in timelines and clusters of images. Have you ever heard anybody say that there's just no good songs anymore? Nobody's writing any good music anymore. You heard that? Now part of that is the old man grump. Right, which we're all susceptible to. They don't make them like they used to anymore, right? We all say that, and in some cases, that's absolutely true. But there's a phenomenon here that's really interesting to me because there hasn't been a lot of music that is anywhere close to what was happening in the 1960s. Now, Scott Joplin, Duke Ellington, those people very much influenced us, in the early days. Of course, we have the war gap. But then look at all this. All these people, Smokey Robinson, Hank Williams, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Paul Simon, Elton John, all these folks writing. Think about the songs they wrote. Think about how you just take one song from each of these people and it's some of the best music you can hear in popular music. Then you scour from 2000 to 2020 and you can't find maybe 2 songs that are that good, right? So why is that? Is that because we've influenced ourselves to death? Is that because we've referred back so much that now it's just a wash? It's an interesting thing because I think there is some truth to it. And the old adage, there's only 12 notes you can play. There's a lot more than that. But, that's the old saying is that, there's only so much that's possible out there. How many possible equations could there be for a good song? You go from the key of C to the key of A to this chord over here, whatever. You put those together and you've got a great song. but then you can't just come out with another one that sounds just like that. It has to be different. The only forms that allow for that are the blues, which allow for a 1-4-5 progression that has lasted from the very beginning of blues up until now. Nobody says you're not being original if they play a 1-4-5 blues progression because it's a blues song. So that's the exception. But for a lot of these other ones, there has to be a level of originality to it. And if you could just consider all the palatable combinations that are possible, we may have exhausted them. You know, consider that. Have we? Of all of the musical combinations that are possible, have we run out of the palatable ones? Because you do have a lot that are possible. Let's say millions and millions. But the lower half of those are like Schoenberg. You just can't listen to it, right? The upper half of it, the upper half of it are the things that are real catchy tunes, earworms, things that you just love to listen to. And yes, we can still hear those new songs coming out now that are catchy in that way, but are they as catchy as Goodbye Yellow Brick Road? Are they as catchy as Hey Jude? No, they are not. So a lot of the things that you hear now kind of refer back to that, but they don't have the same originality. So that's something that's interesting to me. And I could be totally full of it, but I think about this stuff all the time. And I just, you know, Tom may have an opinion. Go for it, Tom.
So I'm just offer up the possibility that it's really related to exposure.
Mm-hmm.
When Hey Jude came out, we were all listening to Hey Jude.
That's right.
If Hey Jude, the very same song, comes out today, only about 3% of us are
Very
dialed
good.
in
Very good point.
where Hey Jude is
Yeah.
playing. So for the next lecture from 2000, I will be talking about
Yeah.
great songs that you guys have never heard.
Yeah. So very good point. Very good point. And that does have a lot to do with it. But if Hey Jude were written now, somebody would use it in a film or a television show, and it would become viral eventually because it's so good a song. You know, it's not that songs are getting lost in the noise. I mean, I've heard a lot of good songs that a lot of other people haven't heard, and that's whatever. But songs that kind of rise above and become seminal, guidepost songs for us as we go along, they usually find a way. You have people out there who are doing film and television scoring now who are doing nothing but listening to the noise of the internet and finding good things and using them for shows. You have kids now who are becoming overnight stars because they make music in their bedroom and they put them on SoundCloud or whatever, and then a producer for Stranger Things or some other show will listen to all these unsigned artists and go, ooh, I like that. And then they'll put it in the show, and all of a sudden, millions of people can hear it. So that is happening in the same way that where's all the good new symphonic music? Well, those composers are all writing for film. You know, I mean, it's amazing to think of what would all these guys have been doing. You know, like why did we just stop having these amazing orchestral works, right? And so as technology changes, all of it changes. But this is a fun thing to think about. I mean, fun. It's actually depressing. Isn't it? But there is something here that, and to further the depression, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I keep waiting to hear the decline of music education and how it...
Very good point. Very good. And Chris was just making this point earlier today that a lot of times what happened with the advent of hip hop is that budgets were cut in a lot of education programs in New York and a lot of other big cities, and so kids stopped learning how to play their own instruments and started going, playing with records and doing other stuff. So yeah, absolutely, the decline in music education probably has a lot to do with it because
there was still the thirst for music.
Yes.
They just didn't have the tools.
Yeah, and these people, most of them, took music lessons. Almost all of them did. Paul McCartney's one of the only people I can think of who didn't know how to read music. Most of these people did, and when you went into the recording studio, there was a lockstep way to do it, and it was a very kind of honored tradition, and yes, that has most definitely gone away, and something to do with it for sure. That's a good thing for another lecture, because that's a big topic. Yeah.
David, don't you think that it's also a social influence?
Okay.
Your social influences, musicians are being influenced by what's going on in society.
Exactly. And most of the time they're mirroring what's happening in society, or at least doing something, saying something about it.
And maybe they're writing for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
There's more money in it.
There's more money in it, but if you look at the way that the music industry worked in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was unbelievably cutthroat, unbelievably unfair to musicians,
Right.
and based on can we repeat the last thing that was popular and make as much money as we can. So it's always been a kind of a corrupted thing. But yeah, I see what you're getting at because it is a little different now in that regard too. See?
And then I think that the fan base puts the pressure on musicians to create certain things.
Yes, and that's another thing that I think is a fascinating part about this is that fans will sometimes want to hear the same thing they've always heard from a band or a musician, but the thing that got them to like that group in the first place is because they heard something they'd never heard before. And so they all of a sudden distrust the newness of innovation. They just want to hear the next thing. Chubby Checker came out with a sequel to The Twist the next summer. He did not have a burning desire to write about let's twist again. You know what I mean? He didn't care about that at all. That was an executive saying, we're going to do another one of these. Get ready, Chuck.
Marty Robbins had a whole string of El Paso songs.
Oh yeah, all the El Paso songs. I mean, American Graffiti had a sequel, more American Graffiti. So yeah, that is a constant thing. So it's really also a matter of which artists are bold enough to innovate, as opposed to the artists that go and just do the thing that's expected of them.
Fan base.
Exactly. See, the Beatles didn't care. The Beatles stopped touring and said, we're going to do what we want. And that ended up becoming more influential than anything else.
And they're coming back.
Yeah, they are. That's what I hear. AI is the fifth member. Yeah. That's so horrible. But this is an interesting thought that Chris brought to my attention. Sorry, that again. This is a quote from a book called All Tomorrow's Parties. These are two characters talking. Alternative subcultures. They were a crucial aspect of industrial civilization in the 2 previous centuries. This is in the future, by the way. They were where industrial civilization went to dream, a sort of unconscious R&D, exploring alternative social strategies, but they became extinct. Extinct, he says. We start picking them before they could ripen. A certain crucial growing period was lost as marketing evolved and the mechanisms of recommodification became quicker and more rapacious. Authentic subcultures required backwaters and time, and there are no more backwaters. Pretty heady, right? Pretty interesting. I would change recommodification to recommendations, because that's what you're getting now is nothing but recommendations. But isn't that interesting? Genres need time to develop, and in such a cash grab culture, they are picked before they're ripe. And this happens to artists who burn out by the time they're in their 20s. This is the type of thing that is influenced greatly by the market and the machinery of making money in music. Absolutely right. But I want to leave you on a positive note. So what I wanted to do as we go through here, let me see. Yeah, there it goes. So there is one of my favorite movies. We have this thing at the museum where occasionally we'll have a movie night. If somebody wins it for an auction or something, and we'll let them go downstairs and we'll pick a movie. And we'll get popcorn and all that good stuff and pizza, and we'll watch the film. Everybody has to bring lawn chairs. It's a lot of fun. And I let them pick the movie if it's something about music. And so this person, the last one, picked the Blues Brothers, which is really funny if you think about the Blues Brothers. There is a moment that happens in the Blues Brothers where Cab Calloway, who was very, very popular in the 30s and 40s, comes out and sings a song called Minnie the Moocher. And he sings it for a group of teenagers. And this movie takes place in 1980. So there's no CGI, there's all real people in the audience. And they got thousands of kids in the audience. Now, of course, none of these kids are actors, so their response is genuine. That's the thing that's fun to look at is the audience in this. Cab Calloway comes out, starts doing Minnie the Moocher in his 1940s zoot suit style. The kids don't know what they're looking at. And by the time it's over, they're all enraptured with it. And the band he's playing with are all guys, from the 60s who Motown musicians and stuff. So you got these 3 generations. It's an interesting little snapshot of time to look at.
Hit it.
Look how still the audience is. Love that shot. Love that shot.
Never noticed that.
Hey folks, here's the story about Minnie the Moocher. She was a low down here chicoocha. She was the roughest, toughest frail, but Minnie had a heart as big as a whale.
Now look at the kids' faces. This is great.
He took her down to Chinatown and he showed her how to take the gong around.
So by the time they get to the end of this, we could look at this all day. But by the time they get to the end, look at what happens. Actually, he does this fun thing with him here.
He gave her things that she was needing.
Kids start to get a little more into it as we go along.
Gold and steel, a diamond car with a platinum wheels.
And these kids in the audience are all kids who were listening to the Ramones, you know, and listening to these bands. This is 1980 when this happened. The song Minnie the Moocher came out in 1930. So we're talking about a long time. And so these kids at first probably think, well, this is a joke. This is something we're going to laugh at. And it ends up becoming a really kind of fun, engaging thing. They're all swinging. Not great. The thing that blows my mind about this is the same distance of time as if today we watched somebody who came up with a song in 1970 or 75. Yeah, that'll make her feel old. But the fact, this is just such a great little snapshot in time that I absolutely love, because you're looking at a bunch of kids who have no connection to this performer whatsoever. But because of the strength of his performance, and actually they like the song too, it, you know, the funny thing is, no matter what form you're talking about, he was talking about things that are the same subject matter as the Ramones. He's talking about people who are cocaine addicts, who are floozies. I mean, that's all in his lyrics. And guaranteed, you know, a lot of the music they were listening to back in the, you know, in the 70s had a lot similar subject matter, right? So it's fascinating that they're able to connect. You know, this guy who was before just sitting like a lump is now whistling. You know, these kids were not directed. They may have been told, stand up at the end. But they really kind of got along with it. And there's some great stories that the filmmakers tell about this particular scene when they did it. So it's one of those lovely things where you see these three generations kind of coming together for that. Yeah.
So whose idea was it to put that in the movie?
You know, I think it was John Belushi's, because John Belushi was one of the main reasons the Blues Brothers happened, he and Dan Aykroyd. But John Belushi was the real music nut among them, and there were a lot of older blues and jazz musicians that he really revered. And I believe he actually saw Cab Calloway out himself. And remember, in the 1970s, the big band jazz music, it was done. Yeah. You know, Charlie Spivak, who was one of the premier trumpet players in big band music, moved to Greenville in the late 70s to start playing at Ye Olde Fireplace, because a lot of these big band guys went out to pasture and started supper clubs to start, approaching a regional dance crowd audience, and it totally worked for them. But they were no longer in the mainstream, so it was a real thing out of nowhere, really a real risk for them to say, let's do Cab Calloway. Of course, part of it's because it's a comedy, and there's comedy inherent in this, lineup already. But it's one of, I died. I think I died just in time. Oh no, there we are. So I think that's probably one of the main reasons they did. John Belushi doesn't get enough credit for what he did for music culture. Actually, he did a lot. Yeah.
The early, Renaissance days, Baroque and all that, no lyrics, always instrumental. Was it the folk era that brought in the lyrics? Because now most of the music, popular music, all has lyrics. It's not, you know, you've got some instrumentals that came in, like
Sure.
maybe the '80s and that, but it seems like you're not getting any top instrumental music anymore.
You know, it's interesting, yeah, because, you know, I mean, words have always been a part of, you know, the folk culture. You know, I mean, the Scotch and Irish music that came over here with my family, they had those long ballads, even if they weren't literate, you know, they still had these stories that in some cases were your family history. You know, grandma falls off the boat and dies, there's a new verse. You know, whatever, you know, we moved to America, there's a new verse. And so that's why Bob Dylan's tradition is so, you know, similar to that, because songs go on for 12 or 13 verses. It goes along with that tradition. So lyrics have always been a part of music in some way, but in terms of like how we're approaching them for popular music, yeah, that's pretty fascinating thing to consider, isn't it?
I think
Yeah.
it goes back to music education. People don't know how to listen to instruments.
Yeah, and instrumental music was primarily
They can't
taken.
identify the instruments. They don't have a clue what's playing.
Yeah, and I think jazz also took some of that, because their jazz has just as much nonverbal or you know, stuff without words as they do with words. And a lot of jazz, really popular jazz, especially the stuff you go to see people improvise, those standards, you can play them without words. And so I think jazz really took the mantle of instrumental music, and including into the 70s when you see progressive jazz players, you know, start to do that more and more. And then that's kind of devolved into, you know, film and television scoring is where you're going to see the instrumental stuff as well. Yeah.
One of my favorite pieces of music is Toccata and Fugue in D minor on the pipe organ.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't imagine many young people getting into that.
Yeah.
But I've heard a couple of versions of it played on electric guitar.
Yep.
And I can only imagine young people would probably eat that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the things that were, I mean, you know, several Simon and Garfunkel songs were taken from, you know, old Irish tunes and things, and so we're always in a period of reinventing. And so yeah, there are some things that will be done in a newer version that people will all of a sudden. We can only hope that happens more, you know, because yeah, pipe organ's not going to be on the radio.
I mean, some of that hair metal, some of the leading guitarists from that era were very much into that type of classical
Yep.
instrumentation and kind of following on the footsteps of Paganini, who was also a guitarist.
That's right. And so a lot of progressive rock people like Yes, you know, King Crimson, all those other prog groups were basically the classical musicians of the 70s, you know, the frustrated classical musicians. They fused rock and roll and classical together. So that's why when you see Yes in concert, Rick Wakeman has to take a 20-minute solo to play some fugue that nobody there wants to hear. But you know, that's what he's doing. And then there's other stuff that happens, but that progressive rock element very much was a part of that. I don't know, Chris wanted to hear it, I didn't want to hear it. But that's, yeah, it's interesting how instrumental music has separated into a different thing. That's a really good point. Thank you for that. I don't have anything else to blab on about. I've kind of blabbed on about everything I was able to find. Are we just confused now, or do we feel like we have things to think about? Yeah? Yeah. That's one of the problems. Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about the studio and how they created that reverb effect?
Yes. So a reverb tunnel is interesting. There's lots of different ways to do it. But for instance, in you know, just the sound itself is something that was also desirable. So you know how Led Zeppelin, the drummer, has this really big sound. John Bonham was known for this huge big sound. They were experimenting with ways to record him, and they put him in a room, and then at the end of the hallway they put the microphone, one of the mics for the mix, and it became this amazing sound they never thought of before. That was in the 70s, of course.
So at Sun Records, Sam
Yep.
Phillips had the tape slapback,
That's right.
which involves a loop of tape.
Yep.
It's a little less than a second reverb, and then of course it erases itself immediately, so it follows along the entire
Yeah.
time you're playing.
That's right.
That was what RCA did not know how to recreate when Elvis went from Sun to RCA.
Yep.
And Sam wasn't about to tell them, so that's what they built, the long echo.
The long echo chambers, and then everybody else who was a disciple of the Nashville sound did that. And so Mark V Recording Studios, that was here, very much was connected to Nashville. They had a few people there that they would get advice from, and they would, of course, buy their equipment from Nashville. And in doing that, they went and studied studios there. Bill Huffman and his brothers would take trips to Nashville to buy equipment, but also to sit at the feet of engineers at, you know, several of the recording studios in town and take copious notes, and they came back here and tried to do Greenville's version. And so their echo chamber was a little bit more, a little crude, but it did the job. If you listen to recordings from the early days of Mark V, it sounds like Elvis, vocals, and they were able to move elements of the chamber to get a longer delay and a shorter delay. And yeah, it's fascinating. Now you can just do it on a computer, no problem at all, but that was fascinating for sure. Yeah. Any other questions?
Les Paul.
Oh yeah, that's
Les
right.
Paul.
Les Paul.
Same thing with recorders.
Absolutely, yeah.
Recording Mary Ford in the bathroom.
When I was younger, we used to record a lot of vocals. I've always been told, record your vocals in the shower. It's the best place to get that natural kind of sound.
With the water running.
Yeah.
I was wondering about the 70s. So, there are still so many of those bands you can go see today. Tower of Power, Earth, Wind, and Fire, and maybe 2 or 3 of the originals will be in it.
Yep.
They've been replaced. And so your children are going to see those same
That's right.
bands, or maybe even your grandchildren. Or you can go see a Led Zeppelin cover band.
That's
you know?
right.
And so it seems like, is that an unusual era that has stayed a preference for
I think it's
like so many generations?
Yeah, I really think it's a phenomenon of the rock and roll culture, because the Stones are still the Stones, which is crazy.
Yeah.
But and the Grateful Dead ran it out until the wheels fell off the bus. And so there are some bands who, if they are popular enough, they can stay influential for longer. But then the demand will be that they come back.
Yeah.
People have wanted a Beatles reunion forever. And you remember the funny thing when on Saturday Night Live when they offered a check for like $5,000 for the Beatles to it was really funny. But that people really wanted it. And I think it's become so commercial now that people are kind of cynical about it, because it is kind of a cash grab for a lot of people. And a lot of these musicians, after they became famous, did not handle their money very well. They had to come back and then the post-addiction tour, whatever it is that they call it. I remember going to see Crosby, Stills, and Nash when I was in high school, and that's very much what it was. And David Crosby came out and gave a 20-minute speech about his battles with addiction and why they did the tour was so that they could help with that. I mean, it was crazy. But that I think is a big part of it, because there is this permanence. I went and saw, when I was a kid, my dad and I went and saw Three Dog Night, of all people. Three Dog Night at the Hyatt Regency. They were playing in a ballroom that was turned into a stage. Yeah, it was a little weird, but we saw the guys, Three Dog Night did their thing, and that influenced me. I went and saw a concert in Spartanburg when I was about 12. Or 13. Moms and the Papas, the Turtles, and the Birds. Right? Great concert. But we were already listening to that stuff because, just like most of the stuff I showed you, when I was at home, I had my parents' 45s in front of me. And I had an older sister, 3 years older. So when she got something, I got. So this Glad All Over by the Dave Clark Five, I wore that thing. I love that song. And so there are other things that you would just get because they were around the house. And that didn't exist 100 years before then. Now, kids not going to pick up sheet music to go, this is cool. Because they don't have to read it. But they can pick up a 45 and listen to it. So that is part of that accelerating that we've seen of exposure and influence, yeah.
Well, and I think too, before, gosh, I'm gonna date myself, but MP3s and then CD cassettes, before all of that, growing up in the 60s and 70s, we listened to what our parents listened to, because we didn't each have, if we did, it was a transistor radio.
That's
We
right.
didn't have, all the stuff that our
That's right.
grandkids have right now. So whatever our parents listened to, especially if they were big music buffs,
Oh, yeah.
we listened to that.
To that. And then occasionally you would have something on television, like, Ed Sullivan Show or something where the Beatles, that TV was their main conduit, to becoming popular. But yeah, it's different as it goes along, yeah.
I think college has a huge influence, because you're
Yeah.
finally you're sharing music again, kind of like in the Renaissance. It's communal.
That's right.
You'll be listening to stuff you'd never ever think of
Yep.
seeking out, but it's just this osmosis of what you
It
hear.
really is.
And it's hitting at a great time of life to take
Yeah.
those influences in that active time.
And I think what's happening now is that younger kids are getting that experience digitally earlier, because they have algorithms, and algorithm is a 4-letter word, yes, but there are some functions of algorithm that will show you things that you didn't know you liked, and it's pretty great. I've discovered a lot of music just by having things suggested to me on Spotify, and it's great. So it's kind of like having a great college roommate with you all the time, going, hey, listen to this, hey, listen to this. And so I do think that that experience still happens, but kids are now getting preloaded, before that. a little bit more. But it's such a communal thing. You want it to come from friends. You know, an algorithm is no substitute for a friend, but you know, it still does some of that job. You know, it can be, I guess. Anybody else? This is great. I love the fact that the second half of this is a conversation. This is absolutely great. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, I don't know if anybody here knows who the Vitamin String Quartet is.
Vitamin String Quartet.
They do popular music. They have like 100 CDs.
Oh.
And they do instrumental,
Yep.
string quartet instrumentation versions of popular music.
Yep.
They were in Clemson at the Brooks Center
Okay.
about 6 weeks ago.
Wow.
I thought it was going to be people my age. There were plenty of teenagers.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Oh yeah. And that's
they were
the
singing, and it's a sing along. I mean,
Yeah.
they encourage people to do karaoke. And,
yeah. Something I've been greatly, you know, just I feel really good about some of this because, you know, yes, the internet, we can talk about how bad it is, but kids, the end result is that kids now, kids under 20, have a much more diverse understanding of music, but they also like older stuff. It surprises you how many kids like Django Reinhardt or something, you know, from the 40s. And because there are bands like Postmodern Jukebox, really popular band, and they'll take songs that are popular now and do them in a 1940s style. And of course, the millennials as a generation were very much interested in doing older style things. You know, it's an old joke about churning their own butter and all this stuff. And I remember teaching a lot of these kids. But you know, that this generation who very much rejects the onset of digital stuff and wants to do things that are more, and that kind of ushered in a new exposure to folk music as well. So it's great that there's a lot of optimism to be had, you know, when it comes to the internet and what it's doing for music, because these kids are coming out with so much more at their fingertips. The thing that we are sad about is it doesn't come as much from a human experience, right? It doesn't come from going to see it in concert or having your sister or your friend show it to you, you know. So it's one of those things, but I think it's all right because the end result is they're getting a much better music vocabulary than any of us had at that age, unless we were really steeped into it. So, yeah.
One last thing. I think when you talk about exposure, part of it has to do with the amount of venues that are available these days. Those have shrunk tremendously.
Yes.
And because of the change in music and what the record companies have done and all that, some of your bigger groups are playing smaller
That's right.
venues because they can't pull in enough people.
That's right.
Because everybody's watching the internet.
Yep.
So that shuts down, you know, kind of pulls back the budding musicians. They have nowhere to go.
Well,
to play.
I can tell you from experience, you know, when I was coming along in the early 2000s, I played in a band that was, you know, we made records, we were around the Southeast, and we were trying to make it happen, right? Which bands try to do. So a place in Greenville called the Handlebar, you know, and other places we would play there. But we came all around at the time when digital music was taking over and people just stopped going to see live music. I mean, it was crazy. And we would go and play at the Handlebar, and we'd be opening up for a band like, you know, Squirrel Nut Zippers or, you know, a bigger group. And there would be, you know, one year there would be 500 people there, and then the next year would be, you know, 50 or 60. And we saw a steady drop of that. And of course, then Greenville lost the Handlebar. Now we're getting to a point where these generations want to go and see live stuff again. So we're getting True Line, which is going to be an amazing venue. We're getting like 3 or 4 other venues downtown in the next 2 years that it's going to change a lot. And I think, COVID aside, people are ready to go back into a live experience. You know, kids are, I hope that we can look at the onset of online music distribution as a phase that is now going to even out into more of a human experience again. I think that's going to happen. So.
Most mid-level musicians don't make any money off of Spotify. They have to tour.
Well, even the big ones.
And so they have to tour and they have to sell merch.
Yeah, you can have 1 million hits on Spotify and make about $17.
Oh.
Yep, it's all about live performance and how you're going to make it there. Guys, this has been wonderful. If you got any other questions, come up and see me. But thank you for